evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Christopher Preston, and I'm an associate professor in the philosophy department here at UM and a fellow at the Center for Ethics. It's my pleasure to introduce Kathleen Dean Moore to you tonight. Before doing so, I would like to first thank President Royce Engstrom and his wife, Mary Engstrom, for their support of this wonderful series throughout the school year. Tonight's talk is also the Brennan Guth Memorial Lecture, so I'd like to thank and acknowledge the Guth family for their support of this event. As many of you will know, Brennan Guth was a world-class kayaker and a graduate of the philosophy department here at UM, who lost his life on a river in Chile in 2001. Brennan's love of the natural world, his keen mind, and his adventuresome spirit have inspired many in Missoula to continue his legacy in numerous ways. Like Brennan Guth, our speaker this evening possesses both a deep love of nature and the ability to inspire. I first met Kathleen Moore 16 years ago, soon after I arrived from England to study environmental philosophy in Oregon. Professor Moore already had a reputation as a productive scholar in traditional areas of philosophy, such as critical thinking, justice, and environmental ethics. In the mid-1990s, she started writing intensively and lyrically about the natural world. In 1996, Professor Moore published River Walking, Reflections on Moving Water, a book that Annick Smith described as containing prose as clear and lucid as the bright waters she loves. Subsequent books, including Pine Island Paradox, Hold Fast, and Wild Comfort, all combine the nuanced observations of a careful naturalist, the insights of a sensitive philosopher, and the elegant expression of a citizen poet. At Oregon State, she's the founding director of the Spring Creek Project, whose mission, pursued through a wide variety of workshops, residencies, and retreats, is to bring together scientists, philosophers, and creative artists to help reimagine how we might dwell in the natural world. At the Andrews Experimental Forest in the Central Cascades, for example, poets and philosophers are spending time alongside natural scientists in a two-century long project to map the ecological, literary, and philosophically significant features of that landscape. Ever pulled to wet and wild places, Dr. Moore spends part of each summer finding nourishment among the Sitka spruce and the salmon streams surrounding the cabin she and her biologist husband share in a beautiful part of Southeast Alaska. Her talk tonight draws on a recently published book she co-edited with Michael Nelson titled Moral Ground: Ethical Action for a Planet in Peril. The book includes essays from more than 80 spiritual leaders, public figures, writers, scientists, and thinkers, each articulating the moral argument for environmental repair. In this book, and in her numerous other works as a writer and educator practicing what she calls engaged philosophy, Dr. Moore leaves us with no doubt that stories and the ideas located behind them matter profoundly. Please join me in welcoming to Missoula Oregon State Distinguished Professor and University Writer Laureate, Kathleen Dean Moore.
Well, thank you, Christopher, and thank you all for coming out tonight. I have to tell you that it's a great privilege to be giving a lecture that is honoring a philosophy student, Brennan Guth. And I just know that there's nothing more wonderful to an old professor than a wonderful philosophy student. And he must have been one of the best. I just wish I had had a chance to be in a classroom with him. And it's a privilege also to be back in Missoula, this extraordinary place. It's no wonder that Brennan loved it. I have never seen a river freeze in waves before. That must have frozen really fast. And to see every single weed has a flag that points to the direction the wind is going. And the students just bicycle by on the ice as if it were midsummer. It's an extraordinary place. And he's amazing. It's an amazing world. It's not just Missoula, it's an amazing world. And I've been thinking about that a lot lately. I've been thinking about how extraordinary it is to find ourselves in this time and place. You know, you start out, 16 billion years ago, something like that. The gushing forth of matter and energy and the streaming out and the spiraling of matter, all these things had to happen to bring us to this time. The sun and the planets, and then on Earth, and maybe only on Earth, the emergence not only of rose bushes and giraffes, but the emergence of human consciousness. And suddenly the universe is able, through our minds, to explore its own meaning. Just imagine. A universe able to celebrate itself in the languages of philosophy and science. A universe able to explore the profound significance of its own existence. And beyond that, the greatest flourishing of life that this world has ever seen. Here is where we are right now. I think it's an extraordinary thing. After 4.6 billion years of Earth history, it has come down to this few decades, this few years in our lifetimes, when we will make this decision. We find ourselves, don't we, in this race between two tipping points. On the one hand, we're racing headlong towards a climatic tipping point that we don't know what it is, when it will occur, or what the consequences will be. But we are led to fully expect, or at least fear, that the climate will change in such ways that it tips us into a new climate regime that's profoundly different from our own. And against that race towards that tipping point is the societal race towards its own tipping point, towards its own growing conviction that we cannot continue to live this way, that we can't destroy our habitats without destroying ourselves, and that we come to a profound turning point where we are suddenly moved into a new way of living on Earth. We don't know who will win that race, but we do know that the race will probably be decided in our own time. And that's what strikes me as absolutely stunning. That we will either leave for the future a world in all its richness and possibility, or we will leave for the future something different, something stripped down, something dangerously unstable that we can't understand. It's amazing. And you know what I think is one of the most extraordinary things about this? Given its profound importance, one of the most extraordinary things is that we aren't talking about it all the time. That we don't gather on the corners and talk in hushed voices so we don't scare the children, so we don't whisper on the pillows to our husbands, "Climate change, my darling." You know? Derek Jensen said it this way. He said, "You know what, you guys? If it were aliens who came down and did to the planet what we're doing, think about what would happen. Say a UFO comes down." Whoops, I forgot my UFO. Say a UFO lands on the Earth, and these little green aliens come marching out, and they start pouring poisons into the river. And they rustle around, and they kill 1 out of every 10 species of organisms on this planet. And then they go off into the south, and they start scraping the tops off. I guess they don't have to go that far south to start scraping the surface off of the earth and the tops off the mountains and dumping them into the valleys. And say these little aliens march around and they start lacing our agricultural fields with poisons. And they start seeding cancer in the products that we use, even for our babies. And what if the aliens continued on to empty our aquifers and to make our rivers undrinkable, or to torch our forest, or to dump so much carbon dioxide into the air that even the climate turned on us? And then what if these aliens took all the resources for themselves and left nothing for the children? And what if at the same time they went around saying asinine things? Like, there was an oil release that was not prevented. Or 50% of the oil spill seems to have disappeared. Or, don't worry, Mother Earth is a tough old gal. You know, what would we do? We wouldn't just change out our light bulbs to compact fluorescence and call it good. We'd bury an axe in their knees. Or some sort of metaphorical similarity. That's an Oregonian-ism. The point is, we wouldn't delay until we had scientific proof that the things they were doing to the planet were actually harmful to us. So what would we do? I don't know. We haven't done much of anything. And in fact, we're poised to do even less, given the recent elections. So honestly, that's the question I want to talk about. Is this a problem? I mean, is it wrong to wreck the world? This is the premise of what I want to say tonight. That climate change is a scientific issue, and climate change is a technological issue. Surely it's an economic issue. It's even a survival issue. But fundamentally, climate change and environmental degradations are moral issues, and they call for a moral response. What I want to submit to you is that it's unjust that a wealthy few nations reap the benefits of the profligate use of natural resources, and they cast the burdens off on those who aren't able to speak in their own defense, people in the future, animals and ecosystems, the marginalized poor. That's a moral problem. I want to say that it's a sin that industrial growth economies are creating a sixth great extinction, a human impact on creation that this world has not seen since the impact of the dinosaurs started the decline of, the impact of the asteroids started the decline of the dinosaurs. And I want to say that it's a crisis of compassion, what we're doing, the dislocation and suffering for people all around the world. Technological fixes are not going to fix a moral problem. It's a moral failing, and it calls for a moral response. So here's what I believe, and I'll just be straightforward about my credo. I believe that taking whatever we need for our comfortable lives and leaving a ransacked and dangerously unstable world for those who are going to come after us is not worthy of us as moral beings. And I believe that we have an affirmative moral duty, a responsibility, individual and collective, to leave a world to the future that is as rich in diversity and possibility as the world that was left to us. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to go around and I'm trying to create a national conversation about the moral imperative of climate change so that we can come up with a global consensus that we have an obligation to the future that matches the scientific global consensus that says that the climate change is real and it's dangerous and it's upon us. So what I want to do is provide the broadest, this is my work, my life's work now, is to provide the broadest panoply of arguments or reasons why it's wrong to wreck the world, so that no matter what a person's worldview is, there are going to be reasons that speak powerfully to that person about their obligations to the future. So what I want to point out is that this kind of moral conversation has been pretty much missing from a conversation that has been dominated by scientific quarrels, silliest scientific disputes about the nature of scientific evidence, and has been dominated by economic talk, climate change, bless it, will create new jobs. And that we haven't really had this moral discourse as part of our national conversation. I think that the absence of this sense of moral imperative has had disastrous consequences for our ability to design any kind of way to go forward. And I'd like to show you why. So clearly, scientists, are you among us? Who are you, scientists? You have climate scientists in the room? Students who are studying climate science. Ooh, we need more of you. Students who would actually consider switching. All of you, okay. Yeah, so scientists have done this heroic job, I mean truly heroic job, of telling us about climate change and telling us about the dangers that it poses, giving us a clear sense of what may happen to the Earth if we don't change our ways of acting. What happened? This was 20 years ago. Nothing much. So they renewed their efforts. They became even more heroic. They sought out partners, writers, journalists to tell the story in more effective terms. They tried harder to speak in one voice. What happened? Not very much. So they redoubled their efforts, trying to speak more loudly. And the point is, they were working on this great faith in human knowledge. They were working on the assumption that if people knew, if they only knew, if they only understood the ramifications of climate change, then they would act. But the point that I want to make is that that is a logical and a practical mistake. Facts are not enough to decide how to go forward. And so I need to talk to you about the practical syllogism. Because I knew, the people are thinking, I knew that if we came to hear a philosopher, we would have to hear about syllogisms, and it's true. Any argument that has a conclusion, that reaches a conclusion about what we ought to do, is going to have two premises, two areas of discourse. The first one is a factual argument. This is the way the world is. This is the way the world will be if we continue in this way. The second, but you can't get from that statement of the facts alone to a conclusion about what we ought to do. You can't get from empirical, descriptive statement to a statement of what we ought to do without a second premise. And that second premise is normative. This is what we value. This is what we think is just. Here is what we think is right and wrong. Here is what we're trying to achieve. Only with those two premises, the empirical and the normative, can you reach a conclusion about what we ought to do. So President Obama is a master of the practical syllogism. And let me just give you an example. He was talking about stem cell research, and he said, scientists tell us that stem cell research has the capacity to ease human suffering. Premise one, right? The empirical premise. And then he said, premise two, my mother always told me that if you could relieve suffering, you should. The normative premise. And so he was able to reach the conclusion that we ought to have more relaxed standards for doing stem cell research, or we might open the door more towards stem cell research. So the same argument works for climate change, and you'll see how it's not facts alone who are going to get us anywhere, and it's not values alone, but that the scientists can't do this alone, and it is a logical mistake to think that they can. We need these partnerships. So here's the argument for climate change. And you can see it in front of you. If we don't act immediately, anthropogenic environmental changes will bring serious harms to the future. Normative premise. It's wrong to harm the future. We have a moral obligation to the future, not to leave it a ransacked and destabilized world. From those two premises together, we can draw a conclusion that we ought to act. So the point that I want to make is that we've done a beautiful job of premise number one, but premise number two has pretty much gone missing. And here is where we need to do our work. We need to do the work of the second premise, a big national, maybe even a global conversation about what it is we really care about. What do we most deeply value? What is unjust in the distribution of benefits and burdens? What is the kind of life that we aim for? What is the good life? If we can say these things, if we can come to some conversation about these, then we might be able to decide how to go forward. So we have to talk about what we believe in. Where does that happen? It happens in literature. Stories are a great accumulated, literature is a great accumulated record of the moral discourse of a culture. It happens in families. It happens in churches. It happens in civic communities and philosophies. This is the work of families, parents talking to their children, telling them, conveying to them what their deepest values are. And you know what? The traditional place for the work of the second premise is in the university. Because it's the university that is the arbiter and the home for discourse about humanity and what is the most fullest humanistic possible life. So another point I want to make is that when this work is all done, when the first premise is established, and when the second premise is established, we can't refuse to act and still think of ourselves as moral, sensible beings. You know, people say, oh, Kathy, you are such a philosopher. This is so unrealistic that values would ever turn anything. But that's just not true. When I look back through history, people say to me, oh, you know, it's always money. It's money that makes everybody decide to act. It's the only motivator. But I think a closer look at history will tell us that the only thing that matches money in the power to move people is morality. And that if you look back in the history of the United States, at those times when we've been able to make a big shift in our social ways of acting, it's been counter to economic arguments and as a consequence of a groundswell of moral affirmation. So for example, you look at the Declaration of Independence and the War of Independence and the forces that created the American Revolution. We hold these truths to be self-evident. And what are those truths? They're these great moral principles about human equality and opportunity. And think of the emancipation of the slaves. If we'd waited around for money to move us, this would not have happened. And in fact, the emancipation of the slaves was a long time coming. But when it did come, it was based on increasingly shared ideas about what is human decency in regard to one another. Or think about the civil rights movement. I have a dream, or I should say, I have a dream. And it's not about iPods, And it's not about Lexuses. It's a dream of equality and opportunity for the children. Think about the Vietnam War and the end of the Vietnam War. Just give example after example when we made a big and oftentimes very sudden shift. It was because of a groundswell of moral affirmation about what's decent. And so the real question that we face, I believe, and that we have to deal with, I believe, is can we save ourselves and can we save our world without that same moral affirmation about the rights of future people and the duties we have of compassion and justice? And if that's a necessary condition for our acting on climate change, how are we going to create that wave of moral affirmation? So, my colleague and I want to tell you about this book, Moral Ground, that we have been working on for the last 3 years. What we're trying to do is, what we did was we contacted about 125 of the world's moral leaders, and we asked them in 2,000 words or less to respond to the question, do we have a moral obligation to the future to leave a world as rich in possibilities and diversity as our own? What are the moral principles? What are the values? What are the moral arguments that would back up that vision of what's worthy of us as moral beings? Do we have an obligation? And then we took this same question out to communities all across the country in town hall conversations. Same question to everyone. This effort to turn back the worst effects of climate change is going to take the greatest exercise of the moral imagination the world has ever seen. It's not enough to ask 100 people. We need to all be contributing our ideas. So what we have learned is that there are many, many different kinds of arguments. The answers came back from all people in all walks of life, on all the continents except Antarctica. And you know, if any of you have connections down to Antarctica, I'd love to get somebody from Antarctica to comment on this. Yes, we have an obligation for any number of reasons. And so what we're not looking for is the right answer here. We're looking for a multitude of arguments, a multitude of reasons, all the reasons in the world why we have to save the planet for people who are, and the beings who are yet to come. So what are the things that we learned from this project? What are the things that all these moral leaders told us? Well, one message sounds loud and clear from almost every writer, and that is that this world that we're living in right now, this decade, is undergoing a fundamental change, a profound shift in our understanding of who we are and what role we play in the world. And that we used to think that it was like a Christmas tree. I call this the Christmas tree model. You see that star up there, that's us. And you see all these other green swirly things? That's all of creation. So this view that we might once have held is that we're separate from the earth, that we are in power and in control, that we are at the top of the pyramid, that the earth was created for our use alone, that we are the pinnacle of creation, and that this other green stuff draws all its value from its usefulness to us, and that we have no obligations except to ourselves as individuals or as a species. That's the view that we're being told by ecologists and all the religions of the world, except for perhaps the monotheistic religions. That view is dangerous and simply false. And that we can't continue with the Christmas tree view of the world. And in fact, we have to think instead of human beings as part of an intricate, delicately balanced system of living and dying, in which the richness of life is created and that we are a part of that richness. This is a diagram of a food web. You see us? See the black dot over at the, let's see, it's over on the left. That's our position in the world. Aldo Leopold says the first premise of any ethic is that the individual is a member of a community of interdependent parts. And this is a new worldview that we're being encouraged to understand, is that we have this richness of life that's created by these systems of living, dying, and because we are part of the Earth's systems, that our existence and our thriving are utterly dependent on their thriving as well. So that's one thing we learned. We also gathered a whole lot of different arguments about why we have an obligation to the future. And I'd like to give you a kind of a sampling of some of those arguments. Do we have a moral obligation to the future to leave a world as rich in diversity and possibility as our own? Yes, we do, for the sake of the children. And here you see the same argument that I showed you before working itself out in this particular way. If we have a moral obligation to protect children, and dear God, if we don't have an obligation to protect children, do we have any obligations at all, the ultimately innocent creatures? If we have an obligation to protect children, and if environmental degradation is manifestly harmful to them, will you grant me that? Will you grant me premise number one? If you will, then we have an obligation to expend extraordinary effort to end those harms and redress the wrongs that we have done to children. So let me read you a quick sample of that argument. And the piece that I want to read comes from an essay by Thomas Friedman. And he's quoting a talk that was given at the 1992 Rio Summit. A 12-year-old girl from Canada, Severin Suzuki, is addressing the General Assembly. I'm only a child, and I don't have all the solutions, but I want you to realize neither do you. You don't know how to bring the salmon back up a dead stream. You don't know how to bring back an animal now extinct. And you can't bring back the forest that once grew where there's now desert. If you don't know how to fix it, please stop breaking it. At school, even in kindergarten, you teach us how to behave in the world. You teach us not to fight with others, to work things out, to respect others, to clean up our mess. Then why do you go out and do the things you tell us not to do? Parents should be able to comfort their children by saying, it's not the end of the world. But I don't think you can say that to us anymore. My dad says, you are what you do, not what you say. Well, what you do makes me cry at night. Do we have an obligation to the future? Yes, for the sake of the children. Do we have an obligation to the future? Yes, because our lives depend on it. You're seeing that same argument over again. If environmental degradation threatens the foundation of human survival, and if human survival is of value, now we could talk about this. I would say that it is, although there are some people who say that like any other organism, when you outlive your that it's possible that humans should simply pass along and leave the world. I'm sorry. Leave the world for other organisms, but I firmly believe in the value of human life. If you do too, and if the environmental degradation threatens the foundations of human survival, then we have an obligation to avert the degradations that threaten our continued existence. And the piece that I'd like to read to illustrate that comes from Daniel Quinn, the author of Ishmael. Do you know his work? He says, the real question is whether we can survive another 90 years in a period of mass extinctions, a period in which between 1.6 and 5 million species are likely to become extinct. We are like people living in a penthouse of a 100-story building. Every day we go downstairs and at random knock out 150 bricks to take upstairs to increase the size of the penthouse. Since the building below consists of millions of bricks, this seems harmless enough for a day. But for 30,000 days? Eventually, inevitably, the streams of vacancy we have created in the fabric of the walls below will come together to produce a complete structural collapse. When this happens, if it is allowed to happen, we will join the general collapse, and our lofty position at the top of the structure will not save us. Do we have an obligation to the future? Yes, because our lives depend on it. Do we have an obligation to the future? Yes, because justice demands it. We've created a situation in which a small percentage of the population reaps the benefits of the profligate use of energy, and a larger majority of blameless people absorb the consequences. This is unfair. It follows that we ought to take action to eliminate that unfairness, that unfair distribution of benefits and burdens. And the person that I want to quote on this is Sheila Watt-Cloutier. Do you know Sheila Watt-Cloutier? She's the former chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. So she's been speaking for the people of the very far north, who are, of course, most seriously affected now by the climate change effects, now, this decade. Here's what she says. And among the harms that we have suffered both in Canada and Alaska are the eroded landscape, the contaminated drinking water, the coastal losses because of erosion, longer sea ice-free seasons, and the melting permafrost. There are unpredictable sea ice conditions. Glaciers are melting, creating rivers instead of streams. And now we have more drownings, where our hunters thought they could cross safely. And it's becoming very stark. And it's becoming a really dangerous reality for many of us up here. And so it's starting to undermine the ecosystem, the very land, ice, and snow that we depend on for our own physical and cultural survival. In fact, what we are doing here is we are defending our right to culture, our right to lands traditionally used and occupied, our right to health, our right to physical security, our right to our own means of subsistence, and our rights to residence and movement. And as our culture is based on the cold, the ice and snow, we are, in essence, defending our right to ice. And one last reason that I'd like to give you. Thank you, you're so kind. Do we have an obligation to the future to save this world in all its beauty? Yes, because we love it. And the piece that I want to quote is my own essay from this book, and I would like to read the entirety of it. It's called The Angelus, the call to forgiveness at the end of the day. And what you need to know about this essay is that its dateline is May 25th, 2025. So I'm imagining myself an elderly woman in 15 years, looking back on those 15 years that transpire between now and that time. So what I'm doing is recounting what happened in the next 15 years, if that makes sense. All right. All those years, the Swainson's thrushes were the first to call in the mornings. That's when I would take a cup of tea and walk into the meadow. Swallows sat on the highest perches, whispering as they waited for light to stream onto the pond. For years, there were flocks of goldfinches. After my husband and I poisoned the bull thistles on the far side of the pond, the goldfinches perched in the willows. The garbage truck backed down the lane, beeping its backup call, making the frogs sing even in the day. I don't know how many frogs there were in the pond then. Thousands, tens of thousands. When the eggs hatched, there were tadpoles. I have seen the shallow edge of the pond black with wiggling tadpoles. There were that many, each with a song growing inside it. In the years when the frog choruses began to fade, scientists said it was a fungus, or maybe bullfrogs were eating the tadpoles. No one knew what to do about the fungus. But people tried to stop the bullfrogs. Standing on the dike, my neighbor shot frogs with a pellet gun, embedding silver BBs in their heads, 12 holes, until she said, "How many holes can I make in a frog's face before it dies? Give me something more powerful." So she took a shotgun and filled the bullfrogs with buckshot, until legs snapped, faces caved in, they slowly sank away. Ravens belled from the top of the oak. When the bats stopped coming, they said that was a fungus too. When the goldfinches came in pairs, not flocks, we told each other that the flocks must be feeding in a neighbor's field. No one could guess where the thrushes had gone. The fields were as empty as the perfect emptiness of a bell. The perfectly shaped absence ringing the Angelus, the evening song, the call for forgiveness at the end of the day. As it happened, that was the spring when our granddaughter was born. I brought her to the pond so she could feel the comfort I had known there for so many years. Killdeer waddled in the mud by the shore, but even then, not so many as before. By then, the pond had sunk into its warm, weedy places, leaving an expanse of cracked earth. I held my granddaughter in my arms and sang to her then, an old lullaby that made her soften like wax in a flame, molding her little body to my bones. The birds and the butterflies fly through the land, Go to sleep, you little baby. She fell asleep in my arms, unafraid. I will tell you, I was so afraid. Poets warned us, writing of the heartbreaking beauty that will remain when there is no heart to break for it. But what if it's worse than that? What if it's the heartbroken children who remain in a world without beauty? How will they find solace in a world without wild music? How will they thrive without green hills edged with oaks? How will they forgive us for letting frog song slip away? It isn't enough to love a child and wish her well. It isn't enough to open my heart to a bird-graced morning. Can I claim to love a morning if I don't protect what creates its beauty? Can I claim to love a child if I don't use all the power of my beating heart to preserve a world that nourishes children's joy? Loving is not a kind of la-di-da. Loving is a sacred trust. To love is to affirm the absolute worth of what you love and to pledge your life to its thriving, to protect it fiercely and faithfully for all time. Ring the Angelus for the finches and the swallows. Ring the bells for frogs floating in bent reeds. Ring the bells for all of us who did not save the songs. Mother of God, ring the bells for every sacred emptiness. Let them echo in the silence at the end of the day. Forgiveness is too much to ask. I would pray for only this, that our granddaughter would hear again the little lick of music, that grace note toward the end of a meadowlark song. Meadowlarks. There were meadowlarks. They sang like angels in the morning. Do we have an obligation to leave to the future a world as rich in diversity and possibility as our own? Yes, for the survival of humankind. Yes, for the sake of the children. Yes, for the sake of all forms of life on the planet. Yes, to honor our duties of gratitude and reciprocity. Yes, for the full expression of human virtue. Yes, because all flourishing is mutual. Yes, for the stewardship of God's creation. Yes, because compassion requires it. Yes, because justice demands it. Yes, because the world is beautiful. Yes, because we love the world. Yes, to honor and celebrate the earth and earth systems. Yes, because our moral integrity requires us to do what's right. Now that brings me to the second part. We will take a short break while I try to breathe. I'm sorry, it must be absolutely disgusting. I've been talking all day, and this might have come to the end of it. So the question that I want to raise is, of course, the question that may well be on all your minds. Okay, so we get it. Okay, so don't keep beating us with that. We get it. What are we supposed to do about it? You know, what are we supposed to do about it? And I have a couple things I'd like to say about that. First is that seems to be such a block for us. There are so many things in the world that are challenging, but I've never seen anything where people were at such a loss as to how to respond. I don't know what it is, but I do want to mention a number of things that I think are blocking us from making progress. I'd like to, for once and for all, address this issue of sacrifice. Because our politicians, at least, although I don't know how many other people, our politicians at least are saying we can't ask the American people to sacrifice, and addressing climate change would involve sacrifice. Well, let's just think about sacrifice for a minute. Carl Safina in the book says that of all the psychopathologies in the climate issue, the most counter-functional thought is that solving the problem is going to require sacrifice. He says, as if our wastefulness of energy and money is not sacrifice, as though war built around oil is not sacrifice, as though losing penguins and polar bears and coral reefs and all the other things that we love is not a sacrifice, as though withered cropland in Africa is not a sacrifice, and empty aquifers and springs, as though displacing millions of coastal people is not a sacrifice. But don't tell me I need to drive less. That would be a sacrifice. He says, we think we don't want to sacrifice, but sacrifice is exactly what we are doing by perpetuating problems that only get worse. We're sacrificing our money, we're sacrificing our children, We're sacrificing what is big and permanent and valuable for what is small and temporary and harmful. We're sacrificing animals, children, and peace to retain wastefulness, all the time enriching those people who disdain us. That makes sense to me. Yeah, you go, Carl. But here's the thing. He's wrong. He's wrong, because this is going to require sacrifice. But think what sacrifice means. Sacrifice, literally, sacrifice, to make sacred. So we are called on to sacrifice in just that way, to look at the gifts that we have been given, to look at the air and the water and the climate, to look at the cropland and the soil and the children, and to hold them in our hands and say, this is a beautiful gift, and I'm grateful to have been given it. This is the way things become sacred. So a life of gratitude and respect for the gifts that we have been given, so that we have a way of making them sacred, that's the kind of sacrifice that we're called on. And that's the kind of sacrifice I think we all would gladly make in order to address these issues of climate change. So let's set aside the notion that we can't sacrifice, because of course we can, and we must, and we're eager to do that. So what about this notion that we don't really have to do much about climate change because technology will save us? That if we just hang in here long enough, somebody's going to invent a way to pull carbon out of the air, or seed the clouds, or drive, or power everything without wrecking everything. The problem with that is that we have a long history of technologies that are presented to us as solutions to problems that become extraordinary problems themselves. And of course, fossil fuel is the first example of that, isn't it? That we had a problem, we needed more energy, so we bring up fossil fuel and we invent ways, technological fixes that allow us to use the fossil fuel to power our engines, a 25-fold increase in energy, just like that. What a wonderful technological fix. Well, I worry about that, and I also worry about this, that when you go online and you look up, how are we going to save the world? So many of the things that we're told to do are also technological fixes. Change out your light bulbs, drive a Prius, take your own bag to the store, take a recyclable cup to the store, recycle. All these kind of things are kind of technological tinkerings around the edges so that we can continue to live a profligate, unjust life and not have to reap the consequences. And that worries me, because I think that we do need to address the basic moral issues that are fundamental to climate change. And we won't do it if we have this faith in technology. Sustainable technologies? Same question. A friend of mine, or same issue. A friend of mine who's a Potawatomi person, a botanist, was talking to an elder, and the elder said, "What's all this talk about sustainability? What does that mean?" And Robin said, "Well, it's sort of like there are these products and these practices that we need to adopt so that we can continue to do and live the way we always have." And the elder said, "Well, you know, it sounds like that sustainability is simply a way to keep on taking and taking, allowing us to continue in our lives without having to make any fundamental change really at all." So I trust that all of us are adopting all these new technologies that we can. I trust that we've already switched out our light bulbs. I trust that we're insulating our homes and putting in beautiful new thermal pane windows, doing all these kinds of things we can to save energy. But I trust at the same time we're realizing that that is only the start. A delaying action perhaps, but that the real moral engagement will have to follow. Let's address the myth that we really don't have to act because it's too late, that the situation is hopeless, that in fact our options are limited and our cities and homes are disgracefully designed and destructive ways of living are protected by tangles of profit all around the world, and we have run out of time. Let's just say that's true. Does that mean we can live a wasteful, profligate, unjust life? It does not, and the fact that people claim it does is based on a logical error. It's a false dichotomy. People think that if you have hope on the one hand, if you lose hope, then you must fall into despair and inaction. That is an extraordinarily disempowering dichotomy, when in fact there's an enormous, fecund, wonderfully fertile area between hope and despair that's called personal integrity. Think integrity, think wholeness, think integers, think whole numbers, think about a life that embodies our values, think about actions that match what we really care about. To live a life of integrity is to live that kind of life where we embody in our lives our values. And the point that I would make is that even if we don't think we can save the world, maybe we can't, even if we don't think we can stop the inexorable process of the heating of the globe, at least we can do what's right. At least we can, in our own lives, act in ways that we think are just. At least in our own lives, we can find the joy and satisfaction of conscientious objection. Hell no, we used to say to the war. We can say the same thing to the forces of destruction that would lead us towards an unlivable future. And then finally, let's get rid of this notion that climate change is somebody else's problem. It's true, isn't it, that we're in a very privileged position up here in the Northwest, and that the worst effects of climate change on us, if Montana is like Oregon, and I'm quoting the scientists who are talking about Oregon, they say here's what's probably going to happen in the next 10, 20 years. There's going to be a great reduction in the amount of water, and there's going to be a great increase in the number of forest fires. But the biggest impact on the land in the Northwest is going to be from a large influx of people who are fleeing from places that are no longer livable. People who are coming up from the south and looking for places where it's possible to make a living. So even if we're living in very privileged places, that's not a reason not to act. And I would point out that yes, it's true that the climate change effects, the thefts, the betrayals are of those people who are least able to defend themselves, the people who cannot speak in their own defense. And who are these people? They are future people, people who don't exist yet, who have no voice whatsoever, whose futures are systematically discounted, literally discounted, whose futures are going to be most affected. That's one group of voiceless people or voiceless creatures. Another group are the plants and the animals and the ecosystems who are being destroyed wholesale to support the lifestyles of the wasteful and disrespectful present. They have no voices in our legal system, very few voices in our legal system, except perhaps if they are endangered species, small percentage. So they can't speak in their own defense too, and they're getting hit hard. The third group are those marginalized people everywhere. People oftentimes marginalized by their poverty or marginalized by their presence at the edges of the continent, in circumpolar regions, in low-lying islands, in areas of drought or flood or disease or famine. And ironically, tragically, the fourth group of voiceless people who seem unable to speak in their own defense are young people. Why do we not hear overwhelmingly from young people? It's their future that is being taken from them. It's their lives and hopes that are being betrayed. What can explain the relative silence of the students? Now, I don't want to speak too broadly because I do understand that there are students, student groups, students communities who are doing marvelous, heroic, creative, imaginative work in climate change. But nothing like what we need. And nothing like what will turn the tide. So we might ask ourselves, what is it that is silencing the students? Now, I really don't know. But if I were one of those aliens, if I were one of those people who came down bent on destroying the earth, the first thing I would want to make sure of doing was silencing the students. Because being a smart alien, well-educated, I would understand that historically it's students who create social change. So the first thing I would do is go after the students and try to take away their voice, try to make it impossible for them to speak in their own defense. And how would I do that? Well, let me think. The first thing I would do is I would create virtual worlds on machines. I would create these virtual landscapes where they can be heroes. I would create places where the students and the young people can go where they can imagine themselves effective and powerful and victorious, so that they don't pay attention to the real world where they are utterly disempowered. That's one thing I might think about doing if I were one of those little green creatures. I might also imagine inventing a technology that allowed us to plug music straight into their ears so that they are effectively isolated from their peers, so that they can't hear the crying out of the earth, so that they can't come together in any kind of meaningful community. I would give them false dreams of prosperity. I would bombard them with messages about a lavish, good life, a vision of this good life that's always beyond their reach, so that they would always have hopes of getting more and more and more. And then you know what I would do? I would design the university to absolutely take away their ability to make moral judgments. And I would do it this way. I would build a university where all the departments were isolated from one another, where a person could take a science class and never draw a moral conclusion from what they know. In fact, I would have the scientists teach their students that it's actually a violation of their duty as a scientist to draw any moral judgments or react emotionally to what they're learning, so that they can be trained not to draw consequences. And then I would probably have a pretty systematic degrading of the humanities. I wouldn't require them to take ethics. In fact, I would really disparage the humanities in this university. I would teach them to isolate all the subjects so that we could graduate certified, well-educated people with with absolute inability to connect the dots or to see the larger picture. And that might just do it, right? If we had well-educated people who were trained in irresponsibility, who were trained to not to draw the moral conclusions from what they're learning and from what they're doing. So we would have engineers who know nothing about moral argument. And we have scientists who would never be advocates. And then I would sit down and I would take everything they had, including their future. So I'm waiting for the students to say, hey, you know, the failure to take action on climate change is a betrayal of our generation. That's what I'm really waiting for. But lacking that, let's talk about one more thing. Oh, you know where that is? All the students coming out to advocate for change? That's the University of Montana. Anybody in their picture? Okay, so number 5, let's figure out what we can do, because I haven't addressed that question yet at all. And in the 5 minutes left to me, let me try to do that quickly. The refusal to act is not enough, and everybody knows it. And all the rules of what we ought to do, we're looking for something that's not so grief-stricken and isolating. We're looking for some ways of acting that aren't sad and that aren't lonely. And when my students come to me and say, what is my calling in this world? I quote Frederick Buechner, who says, if you're looking for your calling, you will find it at the place where your greatest joy intersects with the world's deepest need. We're overwhelmed by news of the world's deepest need, but we forget sometimes to think about our greatest joy. Find that need, of course, but in that desperation, remember to look for your own joy. What do you care about most deeply? Are you an artist? Are you an ice climber? Are you a bicycle racer? Are you a parent? Are you a grandparent? What is it that you value more than anything else in the world? Find that value, find that great joy, and then put it to work in service to the world. Go to that place and do that work. And by that means, make your life an embodiment, make your life a piece of public art. Make your life a true expression and a model of what you most deeply value. So for example, are you an ice climber? Then maybe your work in the world is to save the glaciers. Are you a surfer? Then maybe your work in the world is to apprentice yourself to the person who monitors the inshore waters for pollutants. Are you a Christian? Then your job surely is to honor and preserve God's creation. And your work is to make sure that those grounds around the churches aren't lawns filled with toxins, a dead zone for all creation, but that a person can't even go to church without passing through the greatest nature reserve in the city, filled with birds, that everyone in church has seeds in their socks and birdsong in their ears. You see what I mean? Are you a grandparent? If you're a grandparent, isn't it true there is nothing you care about more than the well-being of your grandchildren? Isn't that true? You would die for them. You would do anything for them. So put together your extraordinary resources, your experience, your political clout, your money, and your time, and start working for the grandkids. Madeline's grandparents' coal boycott, right? Angry grandmothers for civil government, right? Or ferocious climber grandmothers for ice. Whatever you want, what do you care about? go there and do that work. That's, I think, the way that, I'm sorry, we can make our values and the world's needs work together. It's going to be a matter of great imagination and creativity and courage, but it will also be a matter of great joy. There's power in fear, we've known that, and there's power in sorrow, and there's a great deal of power in love, but the greatest power of all is in joy. And that's my suggestion to people, is to find that joy. And I should say in closing that our greatest ally in the work that we do is the earth itself. That the earth itself will help us if we can find that place to go and do our work. And so let me just close with the way that the earth helps me. It's a Wendell Berry poem. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world. Thank you.
Couple of quick reminders from me. Outside the ballroom door, there's several of Kathleen's books are available from the bookstore, and after the Q&A period, she'd be happy to sign copies. There's also an essay by Kathleen in CAMUS, the Environmental Studies Student Journal. Second reminder is, if you do want to ask a question, please use the microphones located here and here so that people who listen to the podcast afterwards can hear your question. Thanks.
Yes, please.
When you were reciting the reasons that students have been silenced, I wondered whether you left one out. I wonder about the failure of the President of the United States to take the problem seriously, and I wonder whether it's time for people like us to start talking loudly about that.
It's a state university, and I'm a state employee. So it's impossible for me to say what I'm about to say. This is outrageous. This is the greatest crisis that we have seen, and he promised us. And all the young people who came out, he promised you. Hold our leaders' feet to the fire, every single one. And I cannot think of a better reason to vote than that we have people in legislative positions who are climate change deniers in great numbers. And the argument for political action has never been greater than now. Yeah, absolutely. I can't say, well, I won't. Thank you for saying it. Yes, please.
Dr. Moore, I'm a graduate student, and so much of what I read about climate change says that individual action is meaningless. How does climate change, how do we help climate change if the only action is at the government level? How do we bring joy to a government?
Well, certainly individual action isn't meaningless when it comes to elections. I mean, I think that voting is a really powerful thing. But why do we have to work as individuals? Why don't we come together as groups? Why don't we meet on the street? Certainly individual action is not, certainly, okay, I'll quarrel first of all with the premise of your question. I don't believe that it's true that individual action is powerless. We might not bring down any significant measurable amount of carbon dioxide, but we can certainly set an example for ourselves. We can certainly set an example for other people, and we can certainly live a joyous life that we believe in even if it's not going to notch down the numbers. So there are all kinds of good reasons for acting as individuals. But the real power is in numbers, and the real power is in collective action. And one thing you can do as an individual is talk to somebody else. And one thing you can do as a pair is talk to another couple people. And one thing that quad can do is talk to 16 more people. And gathering the crowds and gathering the people and then letting your voice be heard. Individual voices can be very strongly heard if they're singing in unison, and even more strongly heard if they're singing in harmony. So we could take a lesson from acoustics about individual action. Sir.
Yeah, my name's Jeff Galis, and I'm from Calgary, Alberta, Canada, which I've come to see is, I used to be proud to be from Canada. I would put a Canadian flag on my backpack when I toured around Europe in the 80s, and I've come to see it as the heart of the monster. And I come from a place where oil and gas representatives and lobby groups call their work to undermine climate legislation and promote the tar sands as God's work. And I could tell you things that would make your hair curl. And I just wonder, in our conversation about bringing morality to bear, to what degree should we call these people out, and to what degree should we simply celebrate the positive aspects of collective action?
That would be a strategic question, wouldn't it? It seems to me that there's an extraordinary absence of righteous indignation. And I think that there might be a real place for that. I think that we have to be really careful about how we use it. But certainly anger, calling evil evil, calling lies lies, calling injustice injustice, is a kind of truth-telling that we really need to engage in. So there is a real positive energy in truth-telling, and if it has to do that sort of work, then I think that that's something that we ought to be doing. Why we're not, I do not understand. Part of the problem is that we're being very effectively told that the problem is us, that we're, as consumers, that we're the ones who are creating the problems, and that may be in many ways the case. And that if we can control our actions as consumers, we then give ourselves legitimacy to speak against the corporations that would try to direct our actions as consumers. So I guess it's first take a deep look inside of ourselves and do what we can to free ourselves from being instruments of destruction. And then once we've done that purifying work, that kind of legitimizing work, then I think we are in a position to tell the truth about destructive practices.
Well, another way you can do that, what I've found through my life, is if you carefully buy only the things that focus that particular action, and corporations get terrified when people start picking and choosing what they buy based on the policies of the corporation themselves. I've seen CEOs turn purple, and it's very easy to do boycotts, and when a particular object purchased is used in a boycott way, corporations change their behaviors. And so that's another thing that individuals can do. And this is particularly easy.
Thank you. You know, do you know Oren Lyons? He's an indigenous leader. He's a wisdom keeper for the Haudenosaunee people. He said that he was having a conversation with such people as Desmond Tutu and Gorbachev, these world leaders, and they had this idea that if a council of elders, a global council of elders, would get together periodically and identify one corporation that seemed to be doing the most damage on Earth, and simply name it, and invite every organization on Earth, every individual on Earth, to stop patronizing that or buying products from that corporation, that it would not be long before that corporation would be making very dramatic changes in its way of doing business. And then they would meet again, and they would name the second. He said they would never have to name the third. Please.
I'm a student here at the University of Montana, and I was wondering what you would recommend for us students to be our first step, and I guess you could say regaining our power.
Oh, boy. I'm not going to stand up here and tell you what to do, but I do think that coming together, I mean, do you think there's a core group here of people who really care and really get it? Yeah. Well then, I think that you ought to start studying student protest techniques. You ought to start studying. I'm not recommending that they do anything at all, right? This is a totally academic exercise. Start studying what were effective techniques by which students in Tiananmen Square, students in the Vietnam War, students during the Civil Rights Movement, how did students make their views known? How have they done that? You guys can take it from there. Sir.
Hey, how you doing?
Well, not so well, thanks.
Again, thanks for coming. I appreciate you coming here and
Oh,
telling us all
it's
this
a joy.
stuff. But I would like to point something out I found kind of interesting. Now, you very much so boldly assert that we're not following the Christmas tree model anymore, or we should not follow that same model. We're not on the top looking down on our planet. But yet, you say throughout your presentation that we need to empower ourselves to save ourselves from ourselves. So how does that correlate? I guess I don't understand.
Well, I think there's a great deal of power in recognizing our place in the universe and in understanding that there are limits to the ways in which we can alter the world without hurting ourselves. And so this great hubris of saying, you know, we can learn everything about the world, and if we learn everything about the world, then we can control it, it's turned out to be not the case. So I'm wondering if we do abandon the model, the Christmas tree model, and start understanding ourselves more truly as part of creation, that we might be more effective actually in preserving the pieces, so that, you know, all the cogs in pieces, and in reducing our damaging effects. So I'm not quite sure that I agree with you that those are in contradiction, unless I've been misunderstood to think that a matter of solving the climate crisis is a matter of controlling the earth. It's more a matter of controlling ourselves. And one more.
Yes, hi. Thank you again for coming and your great talk. I like everything you have to say, and I would be more encouraged, I think, if, well, let me just back up. I think I see an analogy between how we treat the earth and how we treat each other. And the relationships among humans, how we work on that, I think, is part of that cleaning house process that you talked about. And, you know, just today we hear our president talk about how he's backing away from his promise to redistribute wealth and shift the burden on the middle class and working class, and is not willing to go through with having the rich pay more for those sacrifices and those benefits that we endure and enjoy. So I guess what I would like to know is, what's that social moral imperative? Where does that fit side by side with the environmental moral imperative?
You know, they can't be separated, can they? That's the point you're making, isn't it? That really the definition of sustainability in my mind is justice. And that what can be sustained are just relationships among people and other organisms on Earth. And that injustice is deeply unsustainable. So if we're looking for a sustainable world, I think you're quite right. We look quite seriously at the relationship among people as well as the relations among people in other parts of the earth. And oh, the road ahead is going to be long and hard. But it's the road we're going to have to travel. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for your good work.